The first thing I saw was her hand on the coffin rope. It wasn't trembling, though it should have been. A young widow, Evangeline Mercer, lowering her husband Josiah Brant into the earth, and not a tear falling from her eyes. Around her, men grunted under the strain, their palms burning as the coarse hemp rope slid through their fists. Dust swirled across the prairie, catching in their hair and their teeth, while the old wooden well creaked behind us like an unwilling witness. One man was going down into the ground, and yet all I could look at was the widow, standing between the living and the dead, her fingers brushing the stone rim of that well as though she were tethered to it. The people of our settlement whispered prayers under their breath, but even in their hushed voices, I could hear something more, a question none dared to say aloud. Why bury him here? Not in the churchyard, not among family, but beside a well, the only source of water for miles. The logic was practical, at least on the surface. Land was hard, wolves prowled, and the ground here was softer than elsewhere. But to me, it felt like burying him inside the very mouth of life itself, where thirst and death would forever meet. That image clung to me, water drawn up each day from the same earth that now cradled his coffin. Josiah Brant had been a sturdy man, a farmer whose laugh once carried louder than the hammering of fence posts. Yet his end came quietly, they said, from a fever that burned through his body until it left him ash. No one doubted it, not yet. On the frontier, illness was a predator that snatched men faster than bullets. But watching the coffin sink, I wondered why Evangeline's face did not betray the storm the others expected. No swollen eyes, no collapsed shoulders, no wail to break the silence. Instead, she stood tall, her black dress clinging to her frame in the wind, her lips pressed into something that looked less like grief and more like resolve. Some called that strength. Others muttered another word: coldness. The air smelled of pine from the coffin lid, freshly cut, the scent sharp and clean. But underneath there was another odor rising from the soil. A metallic whispers grew bolder. They wondered how a woman so young could already bury a husband, and whether her silence was dignity or something darker. I followed her gaze one last time. She was not looking at the grave, nor at the people, but at the well, its shadow stretching across the dirt like a black hand gripping the mound. She lingered there, still as stone, until the others had left. Only then did she turn, and I swore her eyes met mine, not with sorrow, but with a question unspoken. I left the burial with a weight I could not name. On the frontier, death was common, but this felt different, staged somehow, as if Josiah's grave were not an ending, but the opening move in a story that had only just begun. I told myself it was just the dust, just the fever of my imagination. And yet, standing by that well, I had the sense that Josiah Brant would not be the last man lowered here. The earth seemed to know it too, groaning, as if it were already preparing for another. 2 years later, there would be 6 graves around this well, all belonging to the men who once called themselves Evangeline Mercer's husbands. But back then, none of us knew. We only saw a widow who did not weep, a well that seemed too close to the dead, and a silence that carried more weight than grief should bear. What I didn't realize at that first funeral was that the next coffin would be lowered far sooner than anyone imagined. And when it was, silence would not be enough to smother the whispers. The second coffin sank faster than the first. The ropes slipped through the men's hands with a sharp burn, as though even they wanted the box gone before it could curse them. This time, the silence was different. At Josiah Brant's burial, there had been prayers, hymns, words of comfort. At Silas Crowder's, there was only the scraping of shovels and the sharp hiss of wind cutting through the grass. I stood at the edge of the crowd, and I could feel the weight of every eye darting toward the widow. Evangeline Mercer had buried her second husband in less than a year. Both men lowered beside the same well. That fact alone kept her muttering that Silas had complained about the taste of his evening tea, that it was bitter, harsher than usual. She claimed Evangeline had brewed it herself. At the time, I dismissed it. On the frontier, tea was often little more than boiled leaves or roots, bitter as the soil it grew in. But now, standing by the second grave, the words gnawed at me, like rats at the floorboards. The ground closed over Silas quickly, the men shoveling with a speed that betrayed their unease. Each strike of earth was harder than the last, as though they were trying to bury not just a man, but the questions his death had stirred. And all the while the well loomed, silent and patient, its rope swaying lightly in the breeze. I could not help but notice that Evangeline's gaze lingered on the water's edge, more than on the grave itself. Her black veil fluttered like a shadow tethered to the well's rim. The pastor's voice faltered halfway through the final blessing. He caught himself, adjusted, and finished the prayer, but not before I saw the doubt flicker in his eyes. Even Reverend Dodd, who had buried more souls than any of us could count, seemed unsettled by the repetition. The second cross planted so close to the first. The same woman standing motionless as if rehearsing a role she had already played. When the mourners began to drift away, I stayed behind, lingering near the well. I let my fingers trace the rough grain of its timber frame, worn smooth by rope and water. The wood was damp, though it had not rained in weeks. And in the stillness, I swore I could hear a faint echo from below, like the memory of something dropped into its depths. That night, as the prairie settled into uneasy sleep, I sat at my table with a single question scratching at my mind. Was it truly fever that carried Silas to the grave? Or was there something more deliberate, hidden in the bottom of that bitter cup? The frontier has no shortage of tragedy. But 2 husbands buried beside the same well in less than a year was no ordinary misfortune. It felt like a pattern being drawn, though I could not yet see its full shape. And then came the third death, the one in his veins, a temper that sparked quick but burned out just as fast. He was a man of energy, full of stories, his laughter often rolling through the tavern like thunder. But in the days before his death, that laughter had withered. His skin grew pale, his stomach twisted, his steps unsteady. When I last spoke to him, he clutched his gut and whispered, "That tea, something's not right." It was Jonah Phelps, the storekeeper, who confirmed my unease. He told me he had sold arsenic that week, small paper-wrapped doses marked for rat poison. Nothing unusual in itself. Frontier farms lived at war with vermin. But when I asked who bought it, his brow furrowed. He remembered initials scrawled on the note. E.M. Jonah swore he could not recall if it was Evangeline herself who asked, or someone acting for her. His uncertainty gnawed at me more than certainty ever could. The night of Ansel's burial was colder than the rest. I stood at the edge of the well as the coffin sank, the third shadow cast across the soil. 3 graves now formed a half-moon around the water's edge, a shape that felt intentional, like a circle yet to be completed. Evangeline wore no veil this time, only a dark ribbon in her hair, tied so tightly I thought it might cut. She did not speak a word. She only stood with her hands folded, eyes locked on the bucket swaying at the mouth of the well. Miriam Ketcher's voice carried above the others that evening. "I heard him," she said, "choking after supper. Said his tea was bitter as bile. She made it for him, I swear it." A murmur ran through the crowd, a ripple of unease that even the pastor could not silence. Reverend Dodd reminded them of God's will, of disease and frailty, but his voice lacked conviction. and when he placed his hand on Evangeline's shoulder, I noticed she did not flinch, nor lean into comfort. She simply remained still, as though the accusations drifting around her were nothing more than the wind. I crouched near the grave as the final soil covered Ansel's. Evangeline Mercer had taken something more. What if she had found a way to turn survival into advantage, one husband at a time? By the third grave, the town had split. Some clung to faith and chance. Others whispered the forbidden word, poison. And standing between them all, Evangeline remained unreadable, her expression carved from stone. I thought of the well, of the way its shadow stretched across the graves like a mark of ownership. Each husband had been lowered within reach of its voice, as though the water itself collected their secrets. I could not shake the thought that the well knew more than we did, holding every answer deep beneath the rope and bucket. I did not know it yet, but the truth would not come from a prayer, nor from a grave. It would come from something unearthed in the night, a sound that would rattle the town awake and confirm what many had already feared. The fourth grave was not far off, and when it came, the well was no longer just a witness. It was an accomplice. The storm came in like a beast clawing at the walls. Rain lashed against the windows of the Mercer house, and thunder cracked so close it rattled the nails in the beams. I was outside that night, crouched low against the wind, and I could hear them, the voices of Thaddeus Pike and Evangeline Mercer rising above the storm. Sharp, furious, impossible to mistake. Thaddeus was her fourth husband, and already the land was heavy with graves. He was different from the others, broad-shouldered, proud, a man who believed in the power of ownership. He came into the marriage with debts, and with them, a dangerous urgency. He wanted to sell a portion of the Mercer farm, land that Evangeline guarded like bone and blood. It was not just soil to her. It was survival, the last tether holding her against the wilderness. The argument that night was not hidden by walls. The wind carried every word across the prairie. "I'll have my claim," Thaddeus roared. "A man's land is his right, and you'll not—" The stone rim. The symmetry was unnerving, as if the burials had been mapped out in advance. The townsfolk could no longer hide their unease. When the pastor lifted his hands to bless the grave, I noticed that he stumbled over Thaddeus's name, almost as though speaking it aloud tied him to something dangerous. Jonah Phelps, the storekeeper, pulled me aside after the service. He whispered that Thaddeus had come to him days earlier asking about buyers for farmland, desperate to settle his debts. Jonah swore that Evangeline found out, and that the fight over land had been no secret. "She'd rather bury him than lose that soil," Jonah muttered, his voice trembling. He regretted saying it as soon as the words left his mouth, but they lingered in my mind long after. That night, I returned to the well. The storm had filled it nearly to the brim, and when I lowered the bucket, the rope was slick and cold, as though it resisted my grip. When the bucket struck the water, the splash echoed like a voice from below. I pulled it up, and the surface rippled with flecks of soil, as if the earth itself had bled into the water. I drank none of it. Something in my bones told me the well was no longer a source of life, but a vault of secrets. Each husband laid in its shadow seemed less like coincidence and more like tribute. And I could not tell whether Evangeline was the keeper of this ritual or its captive. What unsettled me most was her face at Thaddeus's burial. She looked neither broken nor defiant. Instead, her eyes seemed to drift past the crowd, past the grave, and fix upon something none of us could see. I thought she was counting, as though already measuring the space for another coffin. The prairie has a way of swallowing truth. Out here, storms erase footprints, dust covers blood, and graves sink quickly into the earth. But secrets do not disappear. They collect, like water at the bottom of a well, dark and waiting. 4 graves now, and yet the circle was not complete. The next discovery would not come from a prayer or a witness. It would come from something unearthed at night, something that confirmed the whispers were no longer.
Could not see their faces, only the arc of dirt flying up against the pale starlight. My heart pounded so loud I feared they might hear it. I wanted to call out, to demand who dared disturb the dead. But something in me froze. What if it was Evangeline herself? What if she was not simply a widow, but a keeper of these graves, tending to them in secret? The thought rooted me in place, and by the time I gathered courage to step forward, the lantern had vanished. When I reached the well, the ground bore the scars of fresh digging. Dark, wet clumps scattered across the grass. The soil too recently turned to be natural. But no sign of what had been uncovered remained. The next morning, whispers spread faster than fire through dry wheat. Miriam Ketcher swore she had heard voices by the well, though her story shifted with every telling. First it was 2 men, then 1 man and a woman, then only the scrape of tools without figures at all. Whatever she heard, the town's suspicion deepened. And when Jonah Phelps produced a note from his store, that suspicion curdled into fear. It was a small scrap of paper, creased and stained, but the writing was clear enough. Arsenic, rat poison. The initials at the bottom were jagged, hastily scrawled. E.M. Jonah insisted it was signed by the buyer who had come for the packet. He believed it was Evangeline Mercer, though he admitted he had not looked closely at her face.
Could have been her,
he said, shifting uneasily.
Or someone sent by her hand.
His uncertainty was worse than proof. The paper passed through the town like a brand, scorching every hand that touched it. Some called it evidence. Others called it coincidence. On the frontier, arsenic was common enough. It kept rats from devouring precious stores. But in the shadow of 3 graves, all watered by the same well, its meaning grew darker. I held the note in my own hands, tracing the rough lines of the initials. If it truly belonged to Evangeline, then the pattern was no longer rumor. 3 dead husbands could be explained away by chance, by fever, by God's will.
Ragged. I had no answers, only more questions.
The graves, the tea, the arsenic note, the midnight digging, each pointed toward Evangeline, yet none could prove her guilt. And still she carried herself with the same unshaken stillness, her eyes calm, her face unreadable. Every whisper only seemed to harden her silence. But silence cannot hold forever. With 4 graves, the town had grown uneasy. With the 5th, it would grow restless. And by the 6th, I feared it would not just whisper, but accuse aloud. The night digging was only the beginning. The well had not finished giving up its secrets. 2 days after that, I watched him stand where no man should wish to stand. Beside the well, across from a widow already mapped by 4 graves. Evangeline Mercer wore a plain dress the color of stove ash, and a ribbon at her throat tied so tight the knot looked permanent. The pastor said a few words, too few for a wedding, too many for a bargain. And when he finished, the wind took the rest. Knew no music, no feast. Just the squeak of the well's beam and the sound of a ring slipping over a hand that had already buried more husbands than any woman should have to name. If there was any blessing that day, it came from the clouds that held their rain as though unwilling to interrupt a ceremony the town did not believe was a ceremony at all. I have tried to decide what I felt watching them. Pity for him, perhaps. Anger for her, or at least at the notion of fate making her a magnet for calamity. But what I remember most is the smell. Sun-baked rope. Iron from the bucket hook. And that faint metallic damp that always rose from the stones after sundown. The well had its own breath, and it touched the wedding like an uninvited guest. Levi was not like the others.
Josiah had been steady. Silas, restless. Ansel, bright and burning. Thaddeus, proud as a blade. Levi carried a different weight. He moved with a patience I did not trust in men his age. The patience of someone who has run out of places to run. He fixed a broken fence rail with careful hands, mended a halt to the neighbor, his temper quick to kindle, claimed a post had drifted, as if wood could migrate like geese. Voices rose. The neighbor shoved Levi. Levi did not move. The second shove came with a curse and a fist. Levi caught the wrist in midair and held it, not cruelly, but with the kind of steadiness that tells a man there is more strength in restraint than in return. When he let go, the neighbor stumbled, embarrassed by his own fury, and spat in the dirt to prove he still had some left. After they left, I walked the line. On one of the posts, a fleck of dried red clung to splintered grain. Blood or paint, I could not know. I rubbed it with my thumb and felt it powder beneath the nail. The wind was high, the grass hissed. It is not always the loud moments that frighten you. Sometimes it is the quiet that follows, the sense that the land has taken down your words and filed them somewhere you cannot reach. Levi's first week on the Mercer place was a tally of small salvations. He coaxed a calf from a narrow wash, found a cracked seam in the cistern and sealed it with pitch, straightened a crooked hinge until the door swung without groaning. Each task seemed to make the house breathe easier. Evangeline spoke less than he did, but when she did, her voice had stopped scraping against its own edges. It was not happiness, not even a cousin of happiness. It was relief, the thin kind that only lasts until the next debt knocks. But the town does not forget what it is training itself to fear. Miriam Ketcher told anyone who would lean close that Evangeline had visited Jonah's store again. This time she claimed she went for lamp oil and needles. This time Jonah said he sold just that. No folded paper, no initials marked for poison. The story should have cooled, but rumor does not need facts. It needs only breath, and the well gave it plenty. The night the weather turned, I could feel the cold before it touched me, the way you can sense a stranger staring before you find his face. A frost rode low in the dark, and the ground, still wet from days prior, exhaled a sweetness that smelled almost pleasant.
At dawn, Levi was racked with fever. It came quick, the way the bad fevers do, marching past caution straight to conquest. Dr. Elias Caraway worked his trade with clean hands and tired eyes. He said the lungs were inflamed, that cold snaps finish what pride begins, and that time would do the rest, if time was polite. It rarely is. He asked what Levi had eaten. Evangeline named bread, salt pork, and tea. The doctor nodded as if that meant something, then placed a palm against Levi's chest and listened like he could hear the decision being made inside. I stood at the door as the day burned off the frost and pretended not to count the graves. Josiah, Silas, Ansel, Thaddeus. 4 shadows when the sun is right. I tried not to see where a 5th would fall if a man lay down in that particular patch of earth. I tried not to notice the way Evangeline's eyes kept finding the well, as if it might tell her what to do. When the fever broke near midnight, Levi slept at last, his breath raking like a saw through soft wood. Evangeline sat by him with a ledger open. Not for money, I think, but because the sight of columns and straight lines can steady a person who has no other walls to lean on. She did not touch his hand. She did not look at me. She watched the candle shrink and let the room learn her silence. If this were a story with mercy, the next morning would have brought relief, and Levi would have stood, and the town would have been forced to practice forgetting. Instead, a wind rose from the north that smelled of iron and old rain, and somewhere a latch gave up its will. Dr. Caraway returned with a face that said he was already losing the argument.
He asked for more boiled water. He asked for blessed luck. And while he worked, a knock sounded at the doorframe. Soft, careful, like a person asking permission to change everything. It was Reverend Alpheus Dodd, hat in hand, eyes too full for a man who claims certainty. He said he had come to pray. He did not say for whom. Behind him, in the yard, Miriam Ketcher stood with her arms crossed, already rehearsing the shape of a word the town had learned to mouth, but not to own. Poison. I did not invite them in. The house felt
Parlor of Reverend Alpheus Dodd was small, paneled in pine that smelled faintly of smoke, as though every sermon had left its mark on the walls. A single lamp threw shadows long and uneasy across the faces gathered there. I had asked them all to come, not because I believed any one of them had the truth, but because I needed to hear their lies side by side, to see where they broke apart. Reverend Dodd sat stiffly in his chair, hands folded as though in perpetual prayer. His voice carried the authority of Scripture, but his eyes betrayed weariness. To his right sat Dr. Elias Caraway, spectacles sliding down the bridge of his nose, fingers stained faintly from herbs and tinctures. Across from them stood Miriam Ketcher, arms crossed, chin raised, her tongue sharpened by years of gossip turned into conviction. When I asked them to speak of Evangeline Mercer and her husbands, the pastor answered first. His words came measured, deliberate, as if he weighed them against eternity before releasing them into the air. "Too many graves," he said. "Too many for chance. The Lord tests us, yes, but he does not mock us. 6 coffins in 2 years? I cannot call that providence." His tone was not accusation, but resignation. A man trying to fit tragedy into faith and failing. Dr. Caraway leaned forward, adjusting his spectacles as though clarity came from glass and not from evidence. "Fevers," he said firmly. "Lung inflammation, harvest sickness, winter chills. I have seen it before. I'll see it again. The prairie swallows the strong with no more effort than the weak. There is no poison here, only disease." He tapped the table once with his forefinger, as if punctuation made certainty. But his eyes flickered when I mentioned the arsenic note, and he shifted in his chair. "Yes, she purchased it, or someone did. But for rats, I tell you, for rats. Half the households keep some hidden away. If every packet meant murder, we'd all be killers." Miriam laughed then, sharp and humorless. Her voice cut through the lamp-lit hush like a knife against bone. "And yet it is her men who fall, not yours, not mine. Always hers. Always the same well watching over them." Drifting to the empty chair at the table's end, the space where Evangeline herself should have been. Perhaps it was cowardice not to invite her. Perhaps it was wisdom. The truth was, I feared her silence more than their noise. She would have sat unmoved, her hands folded, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond us, letting us claw at one another while she remained untouchable. That thought chilled me more than Miriam's accusations. The argument rose and fell like a storm. At one moment, the pastor's voice thundered, "It cannot be accident." At the next, Dr. Caraway whispered almost to himself, "And yet there is no proof." Miriam punctuated it all with sharp laughter and sharper words, weaving half-truths with memories until even I could no longer tell where her witness ended and her invention began. Then came the crack in her story. I pressed her, asked her when exactly she had heard the shovels near the well. She faltered, stammered. First, she said it was the night before Ansel's death. Then she corrected herself, after Thaddeus. A moment later, she insisted it was both, that it had happened more than once. The room grew still. Even Reverend Dodd frowned, and Dr. Caraway allowed himself the faintest smile of vindication. Miriam flushed, angry at herself, angrier at us, and spat, "Believe me or don't. You'll see soon enough." Her words settled like ash, and for a long time no one spoke. The lamp hissed faintly as its oil dwindled.
I realized then that truth was not what we sought in that room. What we wanted was certainty, something we could point to when the next grave was dug. But certainty is a coward's hope on the frontier. We had only fragments, scraps of rumor, notes of poison, echoes of arguments, and the shadow of a well that drank more than water. When we parted, the pastor clasped my arm, his grip trembling.
"Pray,"
He whispered,
"pray it ends with 4.
but his eyes told me he did not believe it would. I stepped out into the night, the air cold enough to bite the lungs. The moon hung pale.
Now, Josiah, Silas, Ansel, Thaddeus. 4 crosses forming a half moon around the rim. When the wind swept across the prairie, the shadows stretched until they nearly touched, like fingers reaching for one another. I could not ignore the geometry of it. Burials should scatter, some near trees, some closer to the house. But here they gathered as though orbiting the well, a constellation drawn in soil and silence. It looked less like chance and more like ritual. I lowered the bucket slowly, listening to the rope squeal against the wood. The sound echoed into the shaft, multiplied until it became something like a voice. When the bucket struck the surface, the splash reverberated up the stones, a hollow, mournful sound that seemed too alive to be water alone. I pulled it up, and the rope resisted, slick with moisture though the air had been dry for weeks. The water in the bucket shimmered dark, holding fragments of reflected sky. I raised it, brought it to my lips, and then stopped. The smell hit first, mineral heavy, metallic, like blood diluted in iron. I dipped my finger and tasted a drop. It was bitter, not unlike the tea Miriam claimed Ansel had cursed before his death. My stomach turned. Was it the natural taste of drought-stricken water, or had something seeped in from the earth that held so many coffins? I crouched lower, studying the soil at the rim. It was damp, darker than the rest of the yard, though the rain had not touched it for days. Fresh shoveling had disturbed the earth, scrapes in the dirt where someone had dug or clawed in the night. I pressed my hand to the soil and felt a chill climb my arm, as though the ground itself rejected my touch. Behind me, the wind carried faint voices. Not words, not clear, but the impression of men murmuring. I turned sharply. The graves lay still, the prairie stretched empty. The voices, if they had been real at all, had come from below. Then I saw it. Caught in the gap between 2 stones was a glint of metal. I grave short of the full design. Evangeline appeared then, quiet as dusk itself, standing across the yard. She said nothing. She only looked at me, then at my hand clenched around the ring. Her eyes were unreadable. Not anger, not sorrow, not fear. Only a kind of recognition, as if she had been waiting for me to find it. Then she turned, walked back into the house, and closed the door behind her. The ring burned in my palm all night. I could not decide if it was evidence, omen, or accident. But I knew one thing with certainty. The well had spoken, and its voice was not done. The 5th grave was coming. I could feel the ground preparing for it, hungry, patient, waiting to close the circle. I sat with the ring on the table before me, the lamplight catching its dull edge, and I realized that every path forward forked into 2. Each scrap of rumor, each coffin by the well, each whispered prayer or accusation, they all pointed in opposite directions. Survivor, predator, mercy, malice. The more I studied the graves, the more I felt the prairie itself was forcing me to choose. The first road was survival, and it had its logic. Out here, life was brittle as glass. one bad harvest or fever away from shattering. Josiah Brandt could have been taken by pneumonia, Silas Crowder by fever, Ansel Rourke by stomach sickness, Thaddeus Pike by the storm's cold hand. Each death plausible, even common, if viewed alone. Evangeline's remarriages could be read as desperation, not design. An unprotected woman needing labor, protection, and claim rights to keep her land. On this road, she was no predator, but a woman crushed by circumstance, bound to the law of survival that made quick marriages and quicker burials a necessity of frontier life. But the second road, darker, wound itself through every unanswered question. Why always the well? Why did Miriam Ketcher claim to hear shovels at night? Why did Jonah Phelps hold a note signed with Evangeline's initials, ordering arsenic?
Land. A man's claim is his right. His words had been desperate, and desperation breeds danger. Was his death Evangeline's doing or the storm's? If she had killed to keep her land, was that cruelty or necessity? On the frontier, soil was not property, it was survival. Could murder be survival's ugly twin? I poured myself a cup of water drawn from the well and stared into its surface. The taste was still bitter, mineral-heavy, leaving my tongue dry. I set the cup down untouched. My own hesitation mocked me. If I, with no fever, no quarrel, no claim, could not drink without fear, then how had 6 men swallowed it day after day? Unless fear was not in the water, but in the woman who stood beside it. The ring gleamed faintly in the lamplight, its engraving nearly erased. A symbol of love or of captivity? I imagined Ansel's hand clutching it in his final days, the bitterness of his tea in his mouth, the suspicion gnawing his last words. And I imagined Evangeline, steady, pouring his cup, lowering his coffin, placing her hand once more on the well's stone. The 2 roads stretched before me, each convincing, each impossible to walk without guilt. If she was innocent, then every whisper had wronged her. Every grave was another stone laid on her shoulders. Her silence nothing but dignity in the face of slander. But if she was guilty, then her silence was the mask of a predator, her survival purchased with the lives of 6 men. The truth was I could not choose. And perhaps that was the point. The prairie does not grant neat endings or clear verdicts. It leaves you with fragments, with rings surfacing in wells and initials on crumpled notes, with the taste of bitter water and the echo of shovels in the night. Out here, truth drowns as quickly as a man in a flood. But one thing gnawed at me. The graves. 4 now and room for more. The half-moon of crosses would soon close into a circle. I had the sinking sense that the land was not finished with its pattern. The well was not done collecting. You bury them by the water. She did not rise. She brushed her palms clean and leaned against the coop, watching me as if I were a student slow to his lesson. Where else would I put them? Her voice was calm, almost gentle. The churchyard is full, the ground too hard. Here the soil gives. Her answer was simple, practical, and utterly unsatisfying. But it is always the same place, I pressed. Always the same shadow. Doesn't it feel like the well is keeping them? For the first time, her eyes shifted. They flicked toward the well, then back to me. The well keeps us all, she said. It gives water. It takes witness. What difference does it make where the bones lie? The wind rattled the boards of the coop. I felt my voice rise with it. The difference is 4 graves already, and perhaps a 5th waiting. The difference is bitter tea, and arguments in storms, and notes signed with your name. The difference is silence, Evangeline. You never cry. You never mourn. People wonder why. Her face did not change, but her hands, folded now in front of her, tightened slightly. Tears don't bring back the dead. Work does. Land
does. If I stopped to grieve every time this prairie asked me to, I would not last a season. It was the first thing she had said that felt like truth, and yet it chilled me more than denial would have. "And the tea?" I asked quietly. Ansel said it was bitter. He said something wasn't right. Her mouth curved, half a smile, half a grimace. Bitter leaves, bitter soil, bitter lives. A woman can only make what she's given. If he thought it was poison, perhaps it was just the taste of the prairie itself. Her words were knives wrapped in linen, soft enough to pass for reason, sharp enough to cut. I wanted to demand more, to ask if she had signed the arsenic note, if she had stood in the night with a shovel in her hands. But the longer I looked at her, the more I knew she would never hand me certainty. She would let the town gnaw on rumor while she lived as she always had. Working, silent, unbent. Final grave being marked before the coffin had even cooled. The fifth cross would not stand alone for long. The circle was closing. The morning they buried Obadiah Flint, the sky was clear, sharp blue. The kind of day that should have carried promise. But on the Mercer land, the air was thick with resignation. No one prayed aloud this time. No one dared. 6 coffins in 2 years, all lowered into the earth beside the same well. By then, the town no longer pretended it was chance. Obadiah had been strong, broad-shouldered with a voice like gravel and a laugh that startled cattle. Some said he was too stubborn to die young. Yet here he was, a coffin cut from pine, his name already carved into the wood before the soil had even settled. His sickness came fast, a fever that left him pale as paper, his breath rattling like loose stones. The doctor shook his head, helpless. The pastor spoke only once, and his words caught in his throat. But it was not Obadiah's death that shook me most. It was the way the land seemed to prepare for him. Days before he passed, I had heard the hammering at dusk, the wooden post rising near the well, an empty cross planted in waiting. And now, that cross bore his name, a grave dug before the body cooled. A ritual, finished at last. The 6 graves formed a circle around the well now, precise as a compass. From above, it would have looked like a wheel. The well at its hub, the husbands its spokes. I could not look at it without feeling the weight of intention. This was not scattering, not accident. It was a pattern carved into the prairie itself. Evangeline Mercer stood at the center of it all, her black dress stiff in the wind, her hands folded in front of her. She did not weep. She did not kneel. She only lifted her eyes once toward the crowd that had gathered, and in that glance, every murmur fell silent. Some swore they saw defiance there. Others claimed it was emptiness. I thought it was something worse. Acceptance. As though she knew the circle was complete and would not resist it. Miriam Ketcher whispered the word
Rim. It was cold. Colder than the air. Colder than flesh. I pulled back quickly, my heart hammering, certain for an instant that something inside had reached for me. I thought of the 2 roads I had weighed, predator or survivor, and realized they no longer mattered. Whether Evangeline Mercer had killed them or simply buried them, the result was the same. 6 men gone, a circle sealed, a well turned into a shrine of silence. The truth was drowned, and the prairie would not return it. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of her standing in the doorway of the house, her figure framed by lamplight. She did not move, did not call, did not hide. She only watched me with eyes that revealed nothing. In that moment, I wondered if she had been waiting for me all along. Not to accuse her, but to bear witness, to carry the story into voices beyond her land. I walked away, but the circle stayed with me, etched into my mind like a scar. 6 graves, 1 well,
and a silence that no prayer could break. But the story did not end there. The circle was closed, yes, but something in the well was still waiting. The morning after Obadiah Flint was lowered into the earth, I returned to the Mercer farm alone. The graves were still raw, the soil damp and unsettled, the 6 crosses casting their shadows like spokes of a wheel. The circle was complete now, and the well stood in its center like a judge who had heard every argument and yet refused to deliver a verdict. The prairie was quiet, too quiet, as if the land itself was holding its breath. I approached the well and placed my hands on the stone rim. It was slick with dew, though the air was dry, and cold enough to sting. I lowered the bucket slowly, listening to the rope groan as it descended. The sound echoed down the shaft until it disappeared into darkness. When the bucket struck the water, the splash came back hollow, strange, like a voice cut off mid-sentence. I hauled it up, my arms trembling with effort, and when I tipped the bucket forward, something clinked against the wood. A small object fell onto the stone. At first, I thought it was just a net threshold of her house, framed by the dim light within. She said nothing, did nothing, only watched. Her eyes were steady, calm, unreadable as ever. For a moment, I considered showing her the ring, holding it up as accusation or proof. But something in her gaze stopped me. It was not fear. It was not guilt. It was permission, as though she was daring me to decide what story I would carry into the world. I closed my fist around the ring and stepped back from the well. The prairie stretched silent around us, the 6 graves heavy in the air. I realized then that no sermon, no doctor's chart, no neighbor's gossip would ever explain this. The truth was buried too deep, drowned in water that reflected nothing but the sky. And yet, there is one more thing. A document I have kept, folded and hidden, one that does not belong to me but came into my hands all the same. It bears a name, a signature, and a line that does not fit with the story the town has chosen to tell. I will not show it now. Not yet. Because the story of Evangeline Mercer is not mine alone to end. 6 graves, 1 well, a widow whose silence was louder than grief. The prairie keeps its secrets, but sometimes it leaves just enough behind to keep us wondering. And now, I leave the choice to you. Survivor or predator?